Okay, let's talk Rhythm of War Part 2. As usual, lots going on here. Um, we'll see if this ends up being one video or two. But as usual, I'm going to start with some character stuff. Starting with, unusually for me, um, Adolin. Adolin is actually becoming a bit of a character for the first time in 4 books. He's been one of the main point of view characters for 4 books now, but I never really count him when I think of like the major characters of the Stormlight Archive, because he just kind of is around. Like, he's just not a particularly interesting or complex character. He doesn't have a lot going on internally. But now he kind of does. He's got some interesting, somewhat belated teenage rebellion going on towards Dalinar, which is interesting and kind of fun to watch. And he's also kind of chafing against all these expectations that have been placed on him, and this makes a lot of sense because Dalinar is many things, but a particularly good dad has never been one of them. I've thought this since book 1. Dalinar has always had some very unreasonable expectations of Adolin in my estimation. I do not like the way that Dalinar always expected Adolin to live up to his standards. And I'm glad that that's being addressed now. I don't think I talked about that in any of my Way of Kings videos, but it's definitely an issue that I had back then as well with Dalinar. And it's being addressed now, which is good. More importantly, however, I think Adolin's story is about to take a really interesting turn, because Adolin is about to go on trial with the Honor Spren, which is pretty interesting. I like that a lot, actually. It's an interesting, I guess, response to the issue of how to appeal to their honor. And I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out, especially with Maya seemingly being healed slowly from being a Deadeye. That'll be interesting to see the results of. That being said, however, Adolin, while he is becoming more interesting, still doesn't have nearly as much for me to talk about as some of the other characters do. So let's move on to my favorite, Shallan. You know how much I love to talk about Shallan. And boy howdy do I have some thoughts about Shallan this week. So Shallan is struggling with recovering the rest of her memories. She's figured out the fact that she actually hasn't recovered all of her memories, which I figured out a bit earlier. Like, I kind of realized there were some gaps in her story. Specifically, everything prior to her stabbing her mom kind of makes no sense, because in order for her to have her shard blade at that point, she would need to have already basically sworn the third ideal, which, as far as we know, she hadn't done, but apparently she did. And that's one issue. The other issue right now is the fact that Pattern is definitely some kind of spy or traitor or working for Mraiz, which I'm really not happy about that. I really like Pattern. I don't want Pattern to be dirty. I think Pattern is probably my favorite Spren in the entire series. I would be very upset if it turned out that Pattern was secretly evil or something. I'm hoping that's not the case. I'm hoping this is something a bit less severe than that. But anyway, what I was going to say was, Shallan is struggling with recovering these earlier memories of her life, and here's where something interesting happens. She says that there is a new persona emerging inside her, which she refers to as formless with a capital F. And she has this theory or this worry that formless is actually the original person that she was, and that Shallan is actually a persona. And that is interesting primarily because at one point, exactly once during this entire time, formless is referred to by a gendered pronoun by Shallan. And that gendered pronoun is he. What's going on there? Now, if you've seen my Edge Dancer videos, you know I am prone to making to looking for potential queer interpretations of characters in stories, and in particular, I sometimes notice things that might hint that a character might be some form of trans or something, which very rarely actually ends up being the case. And I don't think it's. I'm not saying here that we're about to find out that Shallan is actually a trans woman. But it would be plausible, actually. Because we know from the example of the Reshi King that gender transition is one of the things that Stormlight healing can do for you. So it wouldn't be completely out of the question for Shallan to have been assigned male at birth and then become a Radiant as a child by bonding pattern and changed her own body and then wiped the memories from her own mind, and that this might actually be the thing that tipped her mother off, that she's a Radiant and that she should be killed in the name of the Skybreakers. I don't think that's what's going on, though. I'm just putting that out there as like a fun possible interpretation. I don't think that's what's going to turn out to be the case here. I think we're going to find out that something much different and something that I cannot even begin to guess happened in Shallan's early childhood. And I'm hoping we'll find out this book, because it would be annoying if we didn't, frankly. There's a lot of book left. Anyway, that's the main thing I want to talk about. Actually, no, there's another thing I want to talk about with Shallan, which is that she comments a lot in this section, or rather all three of them do, Shallan, Veil, and Radiant, comment on the weirdness of the fact that Veil and Radiant have all these years of experience as a spy and a soldier, respectively, but that experience isn't real. They just think they have years of experience, but like reasonably they know they don't, because they know that they're just inventions of Shallan's. And that must be so weird. I am really, really wondering, like, what would it be like to be Veil or Radiant? To be this fully formed person and not only know that you have to share your body with other people, but know that you don't have a past. That the past you think you have, the memories you think you have, never happened, and you don't actually genuinely have the lived experience that you think you do. That must be a really upsetting feeling. And I'm curious again, because Sanderson did say that he had a DID expert for this book, a dissociative identity disorder expert. And I am curious if this is a thing that DID does. I'm curious if people who have DID, if some of their alters have this experience of knowing that they aren't the real person, quote unquote, and how you would deal with that exactly. It doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like that's going to lead to any conflict between Veil and Shallan. At least I hope not. But it does feel like it would be very upsetting for Veil specifically. Radiant is also hiding something, by the way. We don't know what yet, but it's pretty clear from how she reacts in a few cases here that at least at some point she's done something without Shallan's approval and apparently without Shallan's knowledge. So I don't know what's going on there. I'm just noting that. Anyway, since I'm talking about the Shadesmar crew, Adeline and Shallan, I would be remiss without saying the stump is back! Yay! I don't have any particularly insightful comments about it. I'm just really happy the stump is back. I liked the stump, even though that's a silly name. What else happened here in Shadesmar? So I really like the scene where all the different cryptics from the Shallan's court of Lightweavers, when all the different cryptics are talking to each other and bothering Shallan, they're really cute and really funny and really silly, and I really find that amusing because in book 1, cryptics were portrayed as like these nightmarish horror monsters. And now they're essentially the comic relief, which is a really interesting bit of like, it's like a thing that kind of happened automatically without any exact moment where I can tell, oh, this is where they became the comic relief, but they somehow are. And I kind of like that. Now, as for everything else that happened in Shadesmar, I don't really think there's anything else really for me to talk about other than a few minor comments made by some characters, which I'll talk about later. So let's move on to Urithiru. Now, the main plotline of Urithiru here is obviously the fall of Urithiru to Raboniel and Venli and, what is his name? Lazarian? What was the name of the pursuer? I don't remember. Anyway, those three are the main characters of the conquest. And Navani and Kaladin are the main POVs in Urithiru. And the thing is, I don't have much to say about the conquest of Urithiru yet. I will say it's a surprising occurrence. I didn't see it coming, but I don't have much to say about it yet. I think the next section will be more informative in that regard. What I do want to talk about, however, is Kaladin's character arc in this section. So Kaladin kind of decided to become Roshar's first psychiatrist, I guess, which is not where I thought this story was gonna go. In general, this book seems a lot more concerned with the actual specifics of mental health than previous Stormlight books have been. Now, Stormlight has been a story where mental health has been a major theme since day one. Like, our main characters all have really obvious and really specific troubles with their mental health. Which already makes it kind of interesting as a fantasy story because that's not something you see a lot of. But now in book 4, it feels like Brandon wanted to really, really delve deep into that specific theme. And so not only do we have characters dealing with mental health problems in a lot more detail in both Kaladin and Shallan's case, we also have them actually addressing how people with mental health issues are treated, treated in both senses, treated as in medical treatment and treated as in how society treats them. And I mean, we knew from book 1 that the answer to that, or book 2 actually, that the answer to that question is not good. The Ardents are really bad at it. So I really enjoyed the plot twist, I guess, of Kaladin going into mental health care. But I have some trepidation about how Kaladin's story in this particular section of the book ended. So in the end, Kaladin, as the singers conquered Urithiru, Kaladin kind of snaps when one of the regals comes to take Teft. And Kaladin kind of snaps and kills the regal, and between Lirin's reaction to that and the chapter we get immediately afterwards of Moash/Vyre in the interludes, I kind of get the feeling that we are supposed to interpret this as like a moment where Kaladin stepped closer to the darkness or something. Like this was some kind of dark moment for Kaladin where he became a worse person or became more vulnerable to odium or something like that. And like, I don't buy that. Like I just don't buy Lirin's position in this context. Like, it makes sense that would be Lirin's position, but I feel like the book wants me to agree with Lirin's position, kind of, and like kind of feel like Kaladin did something wrong here. And he really didn't. Like, given the context, given the information he had, he assumed that Teft's life was in danger. And yes, you should, in fact, engage in defensive violence when your life or the life of someone you care about is in danger. That's a good thing. And he also actively tried to avoid killing the guy, so like, I don't know. I don't buy this as like like some kind of dark moment for Kaladin, and I'm hoping that I'm wrong and that the book isn't going to treat it as one going forward. Because I feel like Kaladin has both done worse things and been in darker places mentally than he is right now. That said, I am still waiting to see some of these visions that Moash's been sending him. That sounds interesting. Speaking of Moash, it's interesting that Moash doesn't want to turn Kaladin to Odium's side. Moash wants to kill Kaladin because he thinks that would be a mercy, apparently. Or he wants to convince Kaladin to kill himself or something? But Odium wants Moash to turn Kaladin to his side. And Moash seems to think that he can in fact do that. I don't think that's gonna happen. I'm not particularly concerned about Kaladin being turned to the dark side. I just don't think that would make sense for Kaladin as a character, any more than it made sense for Dalinar in the last book. Like, just like Dalinar resisted, I feel like Kaladin has an even better chance at resisting. If anything, out of our main cast, I feel like it's Adolin and Shallan who are far more theoretically susceptible to some kind of influence from Odium than Cal or Dalinar. So I don't think I'm not particularly concerned about Kaladin going to the dark side or whatever. But it looks like the plot of this book is going to deal, at least in part, with him wrestling with that, which could be really interesting or could be really boring if it feels like there's a foregone conclusion. So I'm going to withhold judgment on that particular plotline until it actually happens. Okay, what else do I have to talk about here? Dalinar doesn't really show up in this section. Taravangian is planning a betrayal, and he does the betrayal at the end here. Ooh, Taravangian has a big moment in this final chapter. It seems like Taravangian is kind of back to not wanting to help Odium. Like, Taravangian did go through with his plan to betray Dalinar, but he's also plotting against Odium again. He's gotten hope back, which he'd lost for a while. And So something interesting happens here, which is that Teravangian realizes Odium's plan, which is the plan itself is interesting. Apparently, Odium plans to use the Singers as an army to basically conquer the rest of the Cosmere and presumably splinter all the other shards, since that appears to be what Odium wants. But more interestingly, Odium appears to fear Nightblood, which is a very disturbing thing to hear, considering that Nightblood was just created by a bunch of mortal scientists. Like, Shashara, what did you do? What kind of nightmare did you make? Jesus Christ. So if Nightblood is the key to defeating Odium, I think the other half of that equation comes from the epigraphs in this section of the book. So these are probably my favorite epigraphs so far, because, okay, this is the final time I'm going to say this. Going forward, I'm going to just assume everyone has read Mistborn Era 1, but from this point on, I'm talking about major spoilers for the end of Mistborn Era 1. Or at least I'm going to assume that you've read Mistborn Era 1 and talk as though you know the big thing that happens at the end there. So, 3, 2, 1. The person that Hoid is apparently talking with here is Sazed, or Harmony. And that's really interesting. This is maybe one of those moments where I'm enjoying the Cosmere elements the most. Like, I'm really, really into the fact that Sazed and Hoid are talking. That's so exciting to me. I don't know why, I just really like that fact. And one of the things Sazed says is that Hoid is wrong for being overly concerned with race. Race, R-A-Y-S-E, not race, R-A-C-E. Race, the person currently holding the Shard of Odium. And Sazed suggests that they should be far more concerned about the Shard itself, rather than the vessel it's currently inhabiting, because the Shard itself has a mind of its own, and the Shard itself is far more dangerous. And this was proven in the case of Ruin, because as we learned from an earlier epigraph in either the first or second book, Ati, the man who held the Shard of Ruin, was actually like a really nice guy before he got the Shard, and then the Shard turned him into something more fitting its themes, as it were. And if that's true, that means that the problem with Odium is not race, it's Odium itself, the concept, the Shard. And that means, in turn, that if race, the man, were to be killed, this would not actually solve anything. Unlike in the case of Ruin, where the death of Ruin allowed the Shard to be picked up by Sazed, I think here the death of race, or Odium, would allow the Shard Odium to be picked up by someone else, but because Sazed had the other Shard as well, Sazed had preservation, that sort of balanced the influence of the two Shards out. But if Sazed had just taken the Shard of Ruin, he would have essentially become the same kind of person that Ati became, and he would have just continued trying to destroy Scadrial. Whereas I think here, because there aren't any other shards to balance out the influence of Odium, if someone were to kill Reyes and take his shard, they would quickly become pretty much the exact same kind of person that we are seeing Odium as right now. So yeah, that's all I really have to say about that. I'm just saying that, like, clearly that's a concern. Now, a brief aside about Mistborn Era 2. Again, some minor spoilers about Mistborn Era 2. At one point, Sazed here says to Hoid, he says, "I've begun searching for a pathway out of this conundrum." This conundrum being the fact that he can't act against Odium or any other shards to defend Scadrial because he's kind of paralyzed by the opposite forces of preservation and ruin. I have begun searching for a pathway out of this conundrum by seeking the ideal person to act on my behalf, someone who embodies both preservation and ruin. A sword, you might say, who can both protect and kill. And Wax has referred to himself, unprompted, as Harmony's sword. Now, how exactly Harmony figures Waxilium Ladrian can do anything against something like Odium, I don't know. But apparently he thinks that that's reasonable or something. I don't know. I just wanted to point out that that weird thing happened here. Let's see, what else happened here? Right, Lift. Lift happened here. Lift has some interesting stuff going on with her here. Now, I'm on record in my Edge Dancer video saying how I feel like there's a lot of potential for a trans reading of Lift. And, oh boy, the fact that she is apparently binding her breasts and feels deeply uncomfortable with the fact that she has them sure adds to that reading. Now, as I've said before, I don't think that's what Brandon is going for here. I don't think we're going to get the reveal that Lift is actually a trans boy. It would be interesting, but I don't think it's going to happen. Lift clearly has issues with puberty and her body changing, not because of anything to do with gender, but rather because she feels like she is becoming a different kind of person. She is no longer going to be the person she remembers being at a time in her life when she was happiest, which is when her mother was alive and she was with her mother. So that is clearly what's going on there. I just wanted to point out that we do still have a lot of support for my reading. Now, let's see, what else happened here? A few random notes. So Raboniel, at one point in the Conquest of Urithiru, uses the phrase, "for Addo's sake." Is she referring to Adonalsium? Does Raboniel know about Adonalsium? Does she worship Adonalsium? I don't know, but that sure sounds like it. Huh, interesting. Let's see, what else? Yeah, the horse spren are apparently imagined by horses, which is very amusing to me. Apparently, the surge of adhesion is a surge that only comes from honor, as opposed to all the other surges which come from honor and cultivation. At least according to Raboniel. So no surges come from odium alone. And presumably no surges come from cultivation alone, but adhesion comes from honor alone. And that's why Kaladin can still use adhesion when everything is blocked at the end. Now, my first thought there was that they're actually just blocking the influence of cultivation, but that doesn't sound right. I think they're blocking the influence of cultivation and honor together. Like, specifically, they're blocking anything that comes from both of them. And so anything that only relies on one of them still functions. And I think that that's the reason why Lift can still use regrowth. Now, this idea that I just spoke would imply that regrowth is a surge of cultivation alone, which I don't think is the case. I think it's more that when Lift uses it, she's using it in a way that's tied primarily to cultivation. I don't know enough yet about this cultivation-honor relationship to really say. These are just random guesses, so take all this with a grain of salt. What else happened here? Right, we learned about some other shards. We learned that there was apparently a shard called Mercy, which I don't think we've heard mentioned before, and also Whimsy and Valor. I don't think we've heard of any of these before. We have heard of Ambition. Ambition is dead. And there's also Invention, which I also don't think we've heard of before. What else? What else? What else? I think that's about it, really. Yeah, those are all the things I want to talk about here. That's not true. I have one major thing I want to talk about, but that's not really relevant to this section. So I'm going to leave that for a later time when it feels more appropriate to talk more about specifically the Sons of Honor as an organization. Because this is a thought I had not because of anything that happened in this section, but just because I was like sitting around and thinking about the Sons of Honor. So I'm going to leave that particular interesting train of thought that I had for later. Yeah, not really a lot of political analysis or even really thematic analysis here besides the stuff about mental illness. This was very much, I feel at least, a plot-heavy section of the book. A lot of reveals about the larger Cosmere plot, a lot of major moves forward in the individual character arcs and plots of the Stormlight Archive, but not a lot of interesting exploration of political topics or philosophy or themes in this particular section. Hopefully next week I'll have more to talk about in that respect. Because I don't want to just talk about the plot, of course. I do try to analyze these books on several different levels. But, like I said, when you do it part by part, the way I'm doing, some weeks you're just gonna get a part that doesn't have a lot to analyze from a certain perspective. And that's okay. So, I'm going to talk to you next week about part 3, which I will have to read at some point in order to make that video. So I'm gonna go do that now, actually. See you next week. Bye.